Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 1% Better Recruitment Podcast with your host, Charles Kiriakou. Today, I'm really excited because we've got Joe Major on the show, who is the founder of Diversity Recruitment. Joe, how's it going today?
Very, very good, thank you. Nice, warm, sunny Essex, and very excited about our conversation.
Likewise. So we've got quite a few topics that we're going to talk about today. And before we started recording, we just had a bit of a conversation that, before we first spoke, my whole perspective on sort of the ED&I stuff was maybe a little bit warped. I think, when we first spoke, I said that there was so much stuff on social media that sometimes you feel like you're just getting bashed over the head. And you said it so well just a moment ago that no one likes to be made to feel like they're a shit human being, right? So I'm really excited to just have this conversation. And for me, I think I'm going to learn a lot. And I'm sure that a lot of people are going to learn a lot more about this topic. But especially one of the topics we're going to speak about is how to incorporate this into more commercial conversations and, of course, into the business development side of things as well. But before we get into the conversation, Joe, for people that may not know you, just give us a bit of a brief introduction to who you are and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm founder of a training advisory and an audit business called Diversity in Recruitment that I set up 3 years ago to mainly focus on supporting recruitment businesses and recruiters agency side. But I found myself kind of moving towards supporting our end clients and employers as well with quite a similar program. My background is the recruitment industry. So I've been in this space for 24 years. I was a recruiter on desk, a billing recruiter and a billing manager, hiring people into my team for 17 and a half years before I got the opportunity to move into an internal learning and development role. And at the same time, as some of us do, take on these additional side hustles that we are particularly passionate about. So I'd kind of made a really interesting industry move when I was on desk and went into that kind of like senior end HR space. And a lot of our clients were like financial professional services. And that was a whole new world to me. I'd spent a lot of time recruiting in education and a lot of time in the nonprofit and public sector space. And that is where I started to have my first experiences of things like bias, not even unconscious bias, very, very vocal and, visible bias and, prejudice, discrimination. And I guess it was like the penny dropped as to just how significant your identity background and circumstance was and how it played out in the opportunities that became available for candidates in certain industries, especially FSPS. And there was something fundamentally wrong about that, for me. And that's where I started my journey of like trying to understand why this stuff happened in the first place, quite naively recruiting away for over 15 years, not really understanding. Gosh, and I guess, I'll call out my own privilege, right? My own identity meant that I wasn't aware of any barriers that I faced, and certainly not of other people. And then stepped into the education and it just didn't stop, made me really, really understand my role as a recruiter and my responsibility as a recruiter in how I could, break down barriers that candidates face, expand talent pools, support clients, etc. So fast forward a few years of doing that kind of like side hustle ED&I social purpose piece blended with a global sales trainer role. And I decided I'd always kind of wanted to set up my own thing, but to be quite honest, I never wanted to set up a recruitment business. I was never brave enough. And then it took until my early 40s for me to really understand where my place was and what I could do. And it was that connecting ED&I strategy into TA and recruitment and upskilling recruiters, giving them confidence, getting them familiar with all the different types of language terminology, and a real focus on the commercial element, how can we expand and develop client services? How can we become better recruiters? How can we improve processes? How can we achieve better ratios, make more money, make more placements, tackle the bias that's costing us a fortune? But then, and also on the flip side, from a very ethical recruitment perspective, how can I improve the candidate experience? How can I use my power and influence to prevent discrimination and prejudice against people? And that's what I get to do now for a living.
Yeah. Love it. Love it. So you mentioned there that there was a few things that happened, in your career that kind of, I guess, sparked this passion, this interest. And, you mentioned there as well about, I guess, identifying where you were sort of more privileged and wanting to help other people that may not have that privilege, I guess, to kind of get to where they want to get to. Was there like a specific time in your career or life that sort of happened?
Do you know what? I'll never forget this. I say an incident. It sounds very dramatic, doesn't it? But it was. I'd started working for this organisation in this new market, and and it's that, when you start with a new organisation, you educate yourself on a new discipline, and I've not kind of like worked in that senior HR space before, so I was going in and I was kind of like, like shadowing other recruiters just to get an understanding of like interview techniques and what good looked like and whatnot. And I was with another recruiter who'd been with the business for a few years, and we both interviewed the same candidates. I mean, I was not coming from a place of never interviewing a candidate. I'd been doing it for over a decade, but this was a new conversation. So, we both met this candidate, and I wrote up my candidate notes, and then this other recruiter wrote up their notes on this particular candidate. But what was fundamentally different was this candidate had been given a grade, right?
Okay.
And this candidate had actually been downgraded because of what I felt were very, very subjective reasons. Okay. And the notes were very much, this candidate is this grade, so this candidate, I wouldn't put that person in front of an A grade client. And I was like,
interesting.
Yeah. And I was like, what do we mean? I don't understand. We both met the same candidate. The experience and the skills and the capability and competency were there. But this person's been has almost been downgraded because of what I see as this subjective stuff, the way, fundamentally a way they presented themselves and the way that they spoke. And I think there was a little sprinkling of education there and, class snobbery. And it was explained to me that this stuff really mattered to clients. And there was, with all the goodwill in the world, we just wouldn't be able to put that particular candidate in front of A grade clients. And it shocked me to my core, Charles. It really did. I was like, wow, isn't this interesting how the all this subjective stuff is influencing the next direction of this candidate, right? And that's just how one particular person feels about them. Why are we not focusing on their ability to do the job? And it was like, it's just the way it is. And you know what? No, that's not good enough for me. That's not, just because that's the way it is, that's not a good enough reason for me to facilitate this kind of nonsense with clients, right? As a business, that's something I felt we should be pushing back, and it just stayed with me. And it was the beginning of my journey, really uncovering like, at the time, what some hiring cultures were.
Yeah, it's interesting. It still happens to this day, right? It happens an awful lot. And when we first met, last week or whenever it was, I mentioned that I had literally the same situation, but polar opposites with two clients, one based in Switzerland, one based in the UK. I should have had my phone on mute. That's awkward. But yeah, one of the clients basically only wanted women and mentioned she wanted young, attractive women, right? So not just any women, young as well, and they have to be attractive. And the other client said that they wanted just men. And then I mentioned to you as well, which I'm not going to repeat, but they mentioned that he didn't want women for multiple reasons, which when he said that to me on the phone, I just remember going like, mate, you can't say this. Like, this is so discriminatory. And because I wasn't upskilled in how to deal with that with a client, my boss at the time said, like, mate, this isn't right. Like, it isn't right, but they're our best. That's the company's best client, and they're on like outrageous fees. Try and get flexibility, and like just give them. And we didn't say this because this was the term, but he mentioned just give them a diverse pool of candidates and do your job. But just be mindful that because they have their mind made up, they probably want to go for just women or just men. So as I mentioned to you, I was putting all types of people, men that were Sikh, women that were from different areas for the guy in Switzerland. They both went for men and women. But I guess from my perspective, I kind of left and went home that day after submitting candidates from all different backgrounds and going, do you know what? I feel like I've done the right thing. I think morally what I've done is right, but I just had no idea how to have that conversation with the client and essentially educate them and consult them that what they're doing is basically wrong.
And dependent on where we recruit and hire from, potentially against the laws as well. So our role as a recruiter is to protect ourselves and our clients from risk and protect our candidates from discrimination. So I think it boils down to a lot of the time this missing piece in the training. Very, very rarely do recruitment businesses actually provide substantial training on the Equality Act 2010. It's not unusual for me to train recruiters who do not know what protected characteristics are, don't know what they can disclose and can't disclose, and not aware of the types of questions that they shouldn't be asking. I mean, we're talking about like ground zero stuff here. And I guess I'm a bit old school, and I'm from I'm built by a deco, and although it wasn't ED&I, it was equal opportunities and the law, and there was lots of multiple laws that have now been covered by the 2010 Act. It was something that we were trained on, we were tested on. I think at some point we were even mystery shopped on. And if you found to be agreeing to any level of discrimination, it had a serious impact on your on your work, right, and your your future within the business. And so when you're right from a young age, that was very much instilled into me, the ethics, the legal side. And are we still equipping recruiters with that knowledge? Are we just assuming that people understand? And I think that's where we're just, recruiters are not empowered to be able to say, my job is to minimize your risk. My role is to make sure that when we hire, we stay within the law. Okay, just as a bare minimum. But if they don't know how to do it, if they don't know how to identify when stuff's wrong, then they're not exactly going to be able to. They're not going to be equipped to have those types of conversations. And also, I've spoken to various recruiters who are from the marginalised groups that the client's treating as a commodity, or even worse, the client is excluding. We don't want any of that community, or that community blatantly to a recruiter who's from that community. And there's no kind of like sense of awareness, from the client to the recruiter. And there's, and there's also, there isn't anything that then for that recruiter to then report back that's happened. There's no consequence to the client. The recruiter can see this blatantly accepted discrimination. How does that then make the recruiter feel? I know the ones that I've spent time and spoken to of like, it's crushing for them to see their manager and their business putting profit before ethics and their well-being and psychological safety.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, it's happened a couple of times in my career. Like I mentioned, I had a female client that was my best client at the time say to me, a biological man, I don't want any blokes on my team. I'm like, sorry, what? Like, do you want me to continue recruiting? I'm a man. Like, what the hell? It's very, very interesting. There's something I wanted to pick up on a second ago, what you said, because, and one of the reasons why I wanted to have this chat with you, and like I said when we first met, is because there are going to be many aspects of the ED&I space that, firstly, I'm definitely not educated on, so I don't know about. But as mentioned in the first topic, which we'll talk about in a second, about it being like constantly bombarded on my feed by people telling me I'm a shit human being. But when you mentioned things like privilege, for example, when I see people on my like personal social medias talk about privilege, I'll be honest with you. And again, this is mainly because I don't really know much about it, but it kind of makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable sometimes, because I've heard people say to me, you know, you're privileged because of the color of your skin, and I'm like, okay. And I've tried to have debates with people on this. I love a debate, but normally whenever I get into the debate with someone, they go, anyway, I don't want to have this conversation anymore. And I always ask them, explain to me what my privilege is. Like, no one has really been able to explain it, and I'm not going to go into like my in-depth personal life story and stuff, but you know, my adolescent years were very far from privilege. You know, we had bailiffs knocking on the door all the time. I was a young carer. I've been broke more times in my life than I can remember. Dad left home, all the rest of it. Like, it was a really awful sort of adolescent time in my life. So when I hear people say, like, my first job, where I essentially got bullied and people used to call me Silver Spoon Charles because I spoke well. Meanwhile, my mum's on benefits and constantly in and out of hospital. I'm like, sorry. So I don't know, like, maybe I'm just rambling a little bit on there, but as an
No,
expert in your sort of field,
no.
you know.
You're not rambling at all. I think that the first thing to address is there's a lot of assumptions made about people's identity. And I'm not a fan of it. You know, people will say, I mean, I've had people throw things at me, you know, this is really unusual that you're in that space, given you've got so much privilege and there's nothing wrong with you.
Oh God.
And
But
you're
people
like,
have actually said that.
Yeah. I've had that. There's nothing wrong with you several times, whether it's for me to then justify why I'm in this space, or you know, just to poke the bear a little bit. And I just go, first of all, you know, my identity is my business, and you don't know anything about my identity. Can we just, you know? And it's about just that's really interesting that you would say that. I'm not going to feel under pressure to start disclosing personal details about my identity, background, and circumstances, but just know that I have lived experience of some things, you know. And I just think it's almost like this. I understand. I definitely feel that we should have the conversation around privilege, but without using it, without weaponizing it. And it's a. Why do I always make sure in my training program with the recruiters, we have it quite early on. What do we actually mean by the word privilege? And I explain it in its simplest terms. What is it about my identity that means that I may not have faced barriers, the same barriers of some of the people that I'm now trying to work towards supporting? What might it be about my own identity that opened doors for me, or at least didn't close them? What is it about my identity that worked for me because I was part of that majority group in that environment? So, you know, and my identity, some identities are fluid. You know, the privileges that I had when I was 25 are very different to the privileges that I have now. But I do this exercise where I read out like 15 statements, and I get the recruiters to, every time I mention a statement that applies to their identity, I get them to like almost climb a virtual ladder. And that ladder is basically to describe it illustrates the potential trajectory of the career. And this is all based on, you know, on data. And, you know, for example, the data will tell us that as a man, Charles, you face less gender discrimination than me as a woman. But it might be that as somebody, so Charles, if you identified as being neurodiverse and I don't, my neurodiversity, my lack of neurodiversity means I don't face the same challenges as you, right? So you have, you know, your gender may be your privilege, whereas my neurotypical brain may be my privilege in some spaces. Okay.
That makes sense.
So that's the way that I describe it, you know, and my kind of privilege is obviously, you know, being a, you know, a white woman. Okay, if we're talking
Mm,
about privilege in terms of race and ethnicity, I my 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 race is not it doesn't hold me back in any way. I've not faced any barriers because of my race. Okay, in comparison to, you know, a person of color. My age is no longer a privilege in comparison to yours, right? Because
mm,
of the data will say that over the age of 40, I'm more likely to face more barriers and age discrimination.
mm-hmm.
I'm neurotypical. I do have a long-term health chronic health condition, which does impact my ability to, for example, to be able. So if you were inviting me to come and work with you and it was a 5-day in office, you know,
Mm,
that would mean that wouldn't work for me. Whereas
right.
may
Yeah.
work for you if you've not got the condition, and so on and so forth. But it's so, you know, it might be that I've got a degree, you might not have a degree. So according to the data, having a degree gives me more privilege than you do from an education
Yeah.
perspective. We might be from different classes. You know, it might be that you mentioned you were a carer, whereas I wasn't a carer. So
Mm,
your caring responsibilities as a young person may have given you less privilege when it came to studying, Saturday jobs, financial resources than me, who wasn't, right? Does that,
mm.
I'm trying
Yeah.
to
No,
give some
that
context to it.
it does, and I think looking at it from like a multifaceted approach, it does make a lot more sense, and it makes me understand it a lot more because yeah, it's not just one thing or the other. And
Yeah.
this goes into our first topic about, you know, bashing people over the head with this topic. What you say, and I really liked our first conversation around your approach to things. Is ultimately just not to weaponize it, and it's just to help people understand, but not in a patronizing and weaponized type of way.
Mm,
The question I had for you on that, actually, it's just coming to my mind. Um, Obviously, you have certain people from everything you've just mentioned there. So, you know, I was obviously a young carer. Mum's been on benefits for like over 10 years. I've got ADHD, which has unfortunately hindered my life a lot. Now I'm medicated, and it's a lot easier to sort of manage. Um, I don't know whether it's because of the way I was brought up, largely because of my mum, but I always took, you know, it was tough for me to get into recruitment. It was tough for me to hold down a
mm,
job. Before I got my first job in recruitment, I couldn't hold a job for more than 3 months. And then my first job in recruitment lasted 4 months, right? So I thought immediately I was just absolutely doomed to never succeed in anything. But there was something in my head that was just like, no matter what, you're going to be successful. And unfortunately, I've got family members that I don't want to say too much, but don't do legal stuff, if that makes sense. They don't do
mm,
stuff that type of way. So I
mm,
don't really have a lot of good, positive role models in my life. But
mm,
I've somehow managed to, by seeking, you know, role models off of podcasts and YouTube videos and things like that, made something of myself despite
mm,
so many barriers that I've had in my life. So the question I had for you is the, you know, if you're, say for example, you're a person of color, you're someone from a lower class, for example, you look at the data and you go, right, so my chances are probably hindered because of X, Y, or Z. Is that more helpful to that person, or do you think that could potentially be something that could further hinder their chances?
Look, I think it's how am I going to approach this question? So I don't think it's the I think it's the so I see my role, my responsibility as a recruiter is to make sure that I can do everything in my power to make sure that those barriers are not factors in
Mm,
my hiring processes. So look, so there's this whole piece around the mindset around overcoming like adversity, you
mm,
know, dealing with the hand that I got dealt with. And, you know, if I can do it, if I can overcome those barriers and I've got the right mindset to overcome those barriers, I don't see any reason why that's an issue. So I will speak to women.
mm,
I've got somebody in mind right now, and I'm using women as an identity because it's my identity. And I might talk to that person how, you know, about some of the challenges I've faced, right? And On paper, she's probably faced more adversity than me, right? She's a different personality type to me, okay? And she'll be like, I got over it, I dealt with it, and look at me now. You know, she's a big deal. If I can do it, other people can do it. And some of this stuff is just an excuse, right? And we've got that relationship, right? She were like, just do it, you know. And I respect her for that, but I think it's really important to understand that not everybody comes to the party with that same level of confidence, right? Some people are bashed right down with the continual barriers that they face, right? The continuation of closed, slammed, bolted doors, and they just don't have it in them to be able to rise above it. You know, and I've spoken to several people recently who are like, it's not just as easy as I'm going to fight back and I'm going to be whatever I want to be, because, you know, this stuff it can be very traumatizing. It can create a whole heap of imposter syndrome. And I think sometimes your personality type, your ability to be able to deal with adversity, your ability to be able to not see those barriers and not accept them. I think Stephen Bartlett's a good example of that, right? He talks quite a lot around, he struggles to understand the challenges that other people of colour face, because he has had whatever opportunities he's had, whatever opportunities created, his mindset, his personality, he has gone on his own journey, and maybe he hasn't faced the same challenges. And sometimes I find, I'm not speaking for him, but sometimes I get a sense that he maybe sometimes minimizes the experience of other people of colour, right? And I just think we just need to be overcoming adversity is a wonderful thing, overcoming bias and discrimination and prejudice. But if you face that 30 times a day for 20 years, 30 years,
compounds.
Exhausting, giving up. It just depends where you are at, your ecosystem, and what resources you've got available, your mindset and your personality type, in my opinion anyway. Does that resonate?
No, that resonates a lot, and I've got a good example that will make sense to what you've just said there. And I think, you know, apologies if that question came across a certain way, because
do not apologize. It was a great question. And you know what? I forgot to say, good for you, right?
Oh, thank you.
in what you're achieving.
Yeah, well, there's a few things that I'd like to unpack, because what you do is, and I love what you do, because it's helping recruiters understand how to deal with this and help clients say, or consult clients, because that's what we are, recruitment consultants, is to consult them and make sure that they are aware of their biases when hiring, and giving them a diverse pool of people, whether they do end up going for that woman or for that bloke or for whatever it is. Our job as recruiters, and we should all be upskilled in this, is to make sure that we are consulting and giving a broad variety of different people. Now, on to your point that you mentioned a second ago, and I think this might make you laugh, right? So normally every Monday I like to start my week with like a 5k run. Last week I done my personal best for like the last 4 years. My nervous system was wrecked after that, and then I stupidly went to a CrossFit class 2 days after, and it was the hardest workout I've ever done in my entire life. So this morning I wrote in my diary, and I've got my plan for the week behind me, that I was going to do a recovery run. And my wife and I haven't done a workout together for a little while. Backwards about 5 years, when we first started dating, she stayed with me and my mum in lockdown, and I took her for a 5k, and she'd never run before. And her parents have framed a picture downstairs of her collapsed outside the house at my mum's house, with me smiling, taking a selfie. And since that day, she's been absolutely traumatized and hates running. And this goes into what you said about mindset, personality type. Now, if that was me, if I went on a 5k with her and she was a runner, I would have taken that experience and gone, that's never going to happen again. I'm going to get better. I'm going to put the miles in. From her perspective, she came out with me today, Charlie, I'm not going to do a 5k. Fine, we'll do 4k. And if you have to stop, we'll stop. I was being super gentle with her, and we did it. We did 4k, and she hated it. She absolutely hated it. And she said to me, I'm traumatized from that first experience. I don't want to do running, blah, blah, blah. She felt fucking great after, though, mind. She was cooking dinner, she's singing and dancing. I'm just like, but her mindset from her lived experience, she's so different to me. And that's what I love about her. She's so different that
Yeah.
she has that experience, and now she unless I physically take her out with me, she won't do it. So I understand what you're saying, and I have to check myself a lot,
Yeah.
because when I speak to recruiters and they're like, oh, because what I do, business development coaching, they're like, I'm really struggling with this cold call. In my mind, I'm just like, mate, just pick up the phone.
Just do it.
Like, you're not
Yeah.
going to die. But there's so many things that have happened in that person's life that I have to be so conscious and empathetic and really try to understand, even if from my lived experience, I'm like, mate, just fucking do it. So I totally hear what you're saying.
And it's really, it's a really powerful ability to have, is to understand someone else's perspective, someone else's backstory. Consider that they have a different lived experience and lens on things. Because, there's this classic saying, isn't it? Treat people how you want to be treated. And it's actually, no, you treat people how they want to be treated. You don't just provide everything that you need, you provide everything that they need. And I guess it could be, I'm just saying this might not be the case, but maybe as my brain is starting to think that's really interesting. What was it about your partner's relationship with sports? And I'm thinking, I'm like, well, I totally get that, because I was bullied by the sports teachers at school because I was, I wasn't a top performer. The way that you got treated at the school that I went to, if you were good at sports, was very, very different to how you got treated if you were not so great at sport. And it was almost like built into my developing brain that being a good sports person meant being a great human and high achieving. Being somebody who wasn't great at sports meant low achievement, low energy, low ambition. You're never going to get anywhere, and you were treated like that. It was loaded in bias. And sometimes we underestimate those early childhood experiences through that early developmental phase to secondary school, and sometimes early employment, and that stuff can leave scars on us. And it can damage us. It really resonates what you said there, Charles, about this sales piece. So very, very early on in my career, when I was in that sales recruitment environment, we're talking the year 2000, 24 years ago, and I was put in a basement room, given a phone and the yellow pages, and was told to pretend that I was the wife of a factory worker who had just moved into the area, so I could get to speak to the factory manager and find out whether or not they use temps, right? Because I worked in industrial recruitment. Now, I cannot tell you, first of all, it goes against my very essence as a human to lie. So to tell a lie was it didn't sit well with me. I hated it. It sounds dramatic, but those a couple of days that I was made to do that put me off sales forever. And actually, even now, I was speaking with a coach that I work with today, and they're teaching me this BD methodology, and it's like, Joe, it's just a voice note, right? It's just a voice note. And I'm like, but I can't do it. There's something in the hard drive here that tells me that I'm that I'm telling lies, that I'm being dishonest, because it's pre-programmed. And I have to be very vocal about that. I'm very, very self-aware. So when we unpick and we digress and we go backwards and stuff, there's usually a reason for our insecurities, our lack of confidence, our imposter syndrome. And I'm sure that you find that a lot, and it's an important part of your coaching and training role to get recruiters to really figure out what is the barrier here.
It's so interesting, and back to what you were talking about then before as well. Something that I do when I'm doing one-to-one coaching, and this is why I always advocate for doing stuff one-to-one off desk, because I give the analogy of opening the hood of the car and really understanding what's wrong with the engine, right? The brain. And if I look back at my childhood, my grandfather, bless his soul, he immigrated from Cyprus when he was 18 years old, didn't know any English, and he got a job in London as like a labourer, whatever. And then he set up a factory in North London and basically produced like XL women's dresses. And his wife at the time was involved in it, and he grew the factory. And bear in mind, this was in like the 50s and 60s that he was doing this. His one of his values and one of his mission statement or whatever it is was to hire people from all creeds, as he would say. So he was a Greek Cypriot man, right? And after he had emigrated to the UK, obviously Turkey invaded Cyprus, so there was a big thing between the Cypriots and the Turks. He had Turkish men and women work in the factory. He had Africans, Indians, Pakistanis. His whole thing was, I want to be surrounded with as many different people as possible, but he always hired on meritocracy. So being around that as a kid and understanding the value of having all different types of people. And he would have every weekend, he would have people have like an Indian night. So the Indians would come in and make their food and share their culture. Then the Turkish would do, etc., etc. And growing up and getting into work, and like I said, I got fired from pretty much every job I worked in, and I was always late and all the rest of it. My mum would always sit there and tell the story about how my grandfather had to overcome all that adversity. And whenever I would come home, cry my eyes out, saying I've just been fired or I've been bullied, etc., she didn't say it in a toxic way like man up, but my mum would always just dust me down and say, life is a bitch. You're going to get kicked in the face. It's your job to get up and punch him back in the face. Go out there, go and get another job. Like, if your grandfather could do it and he didn't speak the bloody language, you can. And it reminded me, like, whenever I had one of these falls from grace or whatever, because I constantly had my mum telling me that, and I had the only positive male role model who grew this business and I was very successful, I kind of thought to myself, right, so when you talk about the computer in the head and the hard drive, I've had that imprinted in my brain to constantly overcome this. And because my mum was always on benefit, or not always, but she was on benefits for a large portion of the time. Before my granddad died, he was in hospital. We had COPD, lung disease. My grandmother, his wife, had a stroke, so she was hospitalized for like 6 months. Because I've been around people that have been very unwell, have come from marginalized communities, I feel like I have almost like this innate ability to get onto people's levels, be empathetic and understand. So it really does pee me off when you hear people, and look, I unsubscribed from Stephen Bartlett. I think he's amazing. I've read his book. Even though I don't like the guy, I read his book because I thought there might be some value from it. But I get you, and I hear sometimes he's done some podcasts about ADHD. It's just like, you should just get on with it, just concentrate. And you're like,
yeah. Just apply. Just
in.
apply. Eat the right diet. You know, take this.
Drink
take
fuel.
This protein. Drink. Yeah. And you know what? I really appreciate you sharing that, and I do understand your perspective. I guess my pushback would be, what if we could have changed? Why is it that you had to work harder? Why did you have to experience either having to walk away or losing your job because your employer couldn't provide the right circumstances and working environment, you know, to support you? So whereas I do think, you know, there is a lot of really useful information out there that, you know, that helps equip candidates and us, you know, to navigate, in this instance, the recruitment process and finding a new job and career shifting and whatnot. A lot of the time they are loaded with us solving the problem, and the angle that I always tend to come at is employer recruiter responsibility. You know, why should you have gone through that, Charles? And it's a really good job that you built of strong stuff, because it could have gone an opposite way for you, right?
It happened. Sorry to interrupt you, but this has happened to family members of mine and friends of mine that also have ADHD, that have also come from family backgrounds where, you know, they didn't have money. Like I tell the story to recruiters all the time that when I was in sixth form, I had to borrow my uncle's shoes so that I could get into sixth form, and they were 3 sizes too big. So I had to wear, it's embarrassing, I had to wear 3 pairs of socks so the shoes would fit, just so I could actually go and study business at school. Do you know what I mean? Like that's most, if that happens to most people will be psychologically traumatized. And I know that type of stuff has happened to close friends of mine, where they're still really struggling in life.
Yeah.
So it's just, I guess if you talk about privilege, one thing that I say to my wife that I'm super privileged about is, yeah, sure, my mum has been on benefits. Sure, my mum has had cancer and every orthopedic surgery, but literally she has molded me into this strong type of personality because of all the crap she's had to go through. I've been
Yeah.
around that. So that's a
And
privilege in one way.
and you know what? And that is, full credit to how you've been brought up by your family. But I get a sense that that's not something that you push on other people, and you're like, well, if I had to deal with
Yeah.
it and it didn't give me any,
I've
so
worked
I
for
think
people like
some
that, Joe.
people
It
hang
pisses
their
me off.
hat on that. The amount, if I had a quid for every time somebody told me that they were brought up on in social housing, which many of us were brought up in, right, in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, that had free school meals, I'd have been retired. But that's your story. But when that's something you hang your hat on and you go, well, it was like this for me and I got over it, so deal with it. The world's not
Yeah.
a wonderful place, and I don't like that. I think it's lazy, and I'm like, hang on a minute, you should want to clear the road for other people behind you, not get everybody jumping over the same bloody boulders that you had to navigate.
Yeah.
And that's where I feel that, as recruiters, we're not always, because of our own identity, because let's face it, I mean, this is a big bold statement, right? But I've not worked with a huge amount of people during my time in the recruitment industry that have faced massive barriers to work. There's been certain hiring strategies from some of the recruitment businesses that I've been a part of that have meant that I've worked with a pretty privileged bunch, like, me included. And that has made it incredibly difficult for them to appreciate and understand the lived experience of other people. And that is, I think, one of our biggest challenges as an industry. How on earth, without training and stepping into the education, can we ever have empathy, and so much empathy that we want to change what we do with other people when we haven't lived it ourselves? And that's why a big part of what I do at the front end of my program is get us to just really reflect on our own identity and think about whether or not it's created blind spots for us. Not shout at everybody and call everybody privileged. It's just gone, you may not have seen that. Do you think you've seen it? If you haven't seen it, what could have been the impact on how you deliver your services? And it's like, the light bulb moment happens just as it did to me, and I wasn't offended.
Yeah. I think everything in recruitment, though, should revolve around empathy. Like when I teach objection handling, for example, and I always like, let's do a quick role play in objections before I go through like the theory of how I would overcome it. And 9 times out of 10, if I say to you, look, you're too expensive, Joe, if you role played, 9 times out of 10, a recruiter would sit there, well, look, the reason why we're expensive, like my back is immediately up, right? So I always say to people, everything in recruitment, always start with empathy. Look, I can understand why you would think that I'm expensive. A lot of people, when I first speak to them, do think that what we do is quite expensive. Out of curiosity, from your perspective, why do you think that is expensive, et cetera, right? I'm just spitballing.
Yeah.
But everything needs to come from a side of empathy. But it's difficult because, like you said, I mean, I've worked for somebody who was the definition. My wife always says he's the definition of white privilege. It's a bit of a joke that she says, but his dad sold a business for 500 million, right? Literally had like servants, all the rest of it. I can do it, then you can. And it's just like, mate, like it's not like that. And then when I said, well, one of the recruiters has got really, really bad anxiety at the moment, blah, blah, blah. Mate, I get anxiety, but you know what I do? I get into work and I crack on. And it just blows my mind that
I go for a 10K and sit in an ice bath.
Hey, careful, that's me. But no, it just, I think everything from, dealing with objections, having client discovery calls, to having the conversation about ED&I, to talking to your clients about their potential bias in consulting, there always needs to be an element of empathy, because you've also got to realize, and I want to talk to you about how we can really fit this into commercial and business development conversations, because you've got to think as well, right? The client that I mentioned at the start of this podcast, they had no idea that was their bias. And
Yeah.
it would be awful for me to then go and weaponize it with him or her and say, you do realize what you're doing is illegal and you shouldn't be doing that. Then they would just be super pissed off. But if you try and get on their level and say, for example, look, I get why you might want to have just women on the stand. A lot of your customer base are men and you think that could be a way. I get that. And like you said, have you considered X, Y, or Z? Or, what would your thoughts be on X, Y, and Z? And try and use the empathy, but then guide them through your expert questioning to help
Yeah.
them open their mind. Because I think, like most things in life, and especially in recruitment, it's about trying to get people to come up to the decision themselves. Because it must be like a human thing, right? If you say to me, Charles, what you're doing is wrong, something in my brain's going to go, the fuck do you think you're talking to? Like, but if you sit there
Yeah.
and ask me some questions and then I go, actually, Joe, do you know what? I've never thought about
Yeah.
using ED&I in my commercial conversations. And then I start asking you questions and then we have more of that sort of productive conversation. So yeah, I like that. So I guess, yeah, that's a good segue then for the next topic. How do you teach recruiters and business owners then to put this into that commercial conversation with clients and into their business development conversations? Because I think even for me as a BD coach, this is going to be super useful as well.
Yeah, it's all about us, thinking about there's two key things when it comes to our client services, but that we're here to do, and that's to help our clients attract talent and help our clients assess talent, right, and acquire that talent. And what we do through the training program is, obviously there's that whole piece on the why and the lived experience. We win the hearts and minds. And then there's that whole practical piece. So we break down, a typical recruitment process, or a retained process. And we look at then how do we integrate inclusion, accessibility, and equity for candidates in that process. We look at the benefits of that to the candidates. Okay, so who's that going by putting that intervention there? Who's going to benefit from it? Who's going to who's more likely to stay in process? Who's more likely to be attracted to the role in the first place? Great. What are the benefits for us? Okay, right. We can improve our CV interview ratios. We can improve our first choice, second choice, and third choice outcomes. Right, because as recruiters, that's where we always want to be, especially as permies. Right, we want to be lining up, people that right up to third choice, best outcome, the client can't choose, and they go with the skills, and then but if that person rejects, we've got we've got a guaranteed placement. So it's like really getting them to understand that this has got massive candidate benefits, but massive process and control benefits for them as well. It gets them closer to the placement. One of the biggest risks to us as recruiters is bias and client preference. Most recruiters are very, very good at skills matching. And the thing that gets in the way of us making money is the client saying they weren't the right fit. And the client not having the skills and capability to assess true culture fit. And it's massively frustrating for so many recruiters. So, train recruiters on enabling their clients, teaching their clients to actually assess and qualify true culture fit from a leadership, management, and team dynamic perspective, as an example. And then I get them to understand that, we look at some of the biggest challenges facing business owners, chief execs, HR directors, and heads of talent. It doesn't matter whether you're doing a CIPD survey or whether you're doing a RecFest survey. ED&I, diversity and inclusion, is usually coming up at number 1 or number 2. I think the RecFest one was a resounding, I think it was the percentage was, even I was shocked at the percentage. It came at number 2, I think, under
wow.
AI and technology, top of the agenda for heads of talent who we sell into, ultimately. So how do we then weave in ED&I into our services and recognize that we have every right to show up to that conversation? It's a pain point for a client. So how can we make sure that we are understanding our clients' pain points and consulting properly with them around it? And in its most basic form, it's often getting clients to understand the difference between positive action and positive discrimination, right? And being able to, as I said before, not telling them off, shouting at them and making them feel a bit shit. More around that, I want to minimize risk here, right? I don't want you getting in a pickle because you've excluded majority groups from your shortlist. We don't want to do that. What I'm here to do is to really lift the bonnet. I'm here to really understand what your organization's doing for that underrepresented group, what it's like to work for your business, what your culture's like, what your values are like. And I'm here to build the best marketing proposition that is going to eventually attract that talent, if not now, further down the line. And at the same time, I'm going to work with you to make sure that your recruitment processes are inclusive, accessible, and equitable. Right? Because we can guarantee all of that lovely stuff as recruiters, but what we can't definitely guarantee is diversity at the beginning. That is an outcome. So can I come and see you? Or can we spend some time together having a different type of conversation? Right. And that's where we can start to do, once we've got the skills and ability to do it, Charles, that's when we can start to do EVP audits, career page, website audits. How is your business really selling you, right? So when my candidates are doing their research, what's their experience of your website and your employee value proposition and your career page? Okay, usually a bit shit, right? How can I then help you improve that? It might be a job description evaluation. It might be collecting diversity and demographic data. It might be creating advice on how many stages makes an inclusive process. Who should be on the interview panel? Okay. What understanding the inclusive benefits that your client's offering so you can spotlight them in all your marketing collateral, doing a deep dive on things like family building benefits, flexible hybrid working, all really important stuff when you're thinking about inclusive hiring. It might even be figuring out, can I ask you a few questions about your current interview process? What training do you give your hiring managers? And you might notice some real pain points. They basically grab the JD and make it up as they go along. And it's like, what if I provided you with a set of competency-based questions based on that job description, and then also gave you a set of behavioral-based questions? We had a discussion around the weighting of those questions and answers. I built you a scoring matrix, right? I could even do a half an hour quick workshop with your hiring managers. And what do we see happening? We see more competency at interview, better candidate experiences. We've gained loads of control, right? I know some people don't like that word, but we've gained control. We've got brownie points with the client. We're offering strategic consulting, hiring expertise, and none of our competitors are doing that stuff. And you know what? It might sound like really confusing, but it ain't rocket science. It's so easy.
I love it. From my perspective, right? So this is how I've internalized a lot of what you've just said, right? Because I work a lot with recruiters predominantly on that business development piece. And I always say to people, you've got to try and stand out, but whilst trying to stay within the company's values, your personal values, and your authentic self, which is an interesting thing, but that's for another day. But talking about all those other things is exactly how I like to recruit. You're a consultant, you're consulting your client, and these are all additional things. So I think for listeners that are either leading a team, running their own business, or you're just a recruitment consultant, if you're thinking about why a client should pay the fee that you offer, if you think that you're expensive, if you can incorporate some of these things, then that fee will make the client will look at that and go, okay, great. Rather than a lot of companies that say, it's 20% contingent, 25% retained, or vice versa. What's the difference? There is no difference. Do you know what I mean? It's like, what else are you actually doing? And I think for, a lot of the companies I work with are within tech. Like, Joe, honestly, I worked for a company and they were actively avoiding candidates with specific names because they knew their hiring managers would just reject them immediately after seeing their CV, because their past lived experiences every single time they've interviewed a candidate with a similar type of name. Their communication skills haven't been right. So a lot of these people need to be educated. So yeah, I love everything that you've just said in there, Joe. Before we get on to the final question, though, because I'm conscious of time, there was a topic that we wanted to speak about, and I think, to be fair, you've done a good job of covering this already. But as I mentioned at the start, I feel like sometimes when you speak to somebody in ED&I, you feel like you almost have to tread on eggshells. We've only met twice. We've only spoke twice. I don't feel like I have to tread on eggshells around you, because you're just so, like, there's a level of just, you're just very factual in what you say, but there's a lot of empathy behind it as well, which I really, really love. So how do recruiters, business owners, and just people in general have this conversation without feeling like they have to walk on eggshells around this particular topic, do you think?
I think that first of all, we give ourselves permission. I think that's the most important thing. A lot of people don't feel like they've got any right, especially people from majority groups. You know, they don't feel they've got any right to get involved. And we're talking about talent attraction and recruitment here. And this is a TA and recruitment strategy, inclusive, accessible and equitable recruitment. You have every right to show up to that conversation. So have confidence in that. Appreciate that nobody's expecting you to be an expert, okay? You are learning. It might be that you're at the beginning of your learning journey and you're just saying to your client, you know what? We just started this training program, or I read this article, or I watched this webinar between Charles and Joe, and you know, I don't know if you want to watch it, but it's really interesting. I want to like develop in this space. What do you think? Are you having conversations internally about this stuff? I'm not going in there giving it the massive ones, like all of a sudden I'm an ED&I expert, which I never call myself even now. I'm just like, I'm thinking about this. Are you thinking about that? Should we think about it together? Beautiful. Let's do it. And I also think, like, you know, creating a safe space, because you know what, we are going to get stuff wrong. I might use language that is fully acceptable within the ED&I community and as up to date as possible. But a word that I might use might not be the word that somebody describes themselves as. And rather than, you know, it's like just being really, really open to learning and listening and open to other people's feedback without like pointing fingers, telling people off, getting grumpy and making everything into a big old argument. And I think, as we might have spoken about the other week, I always think, like, what is the intent here? I can tell the difference between somebody who's been a bit of a right and is just wanting to, you know, wants a row, and I'll be like, get back in your box, mate. And I can tell the difference between that person that wants a row or the person that just said something and they've not got 7 years of education. And what we don't do is humiliate those people and call them out and make them feel stupid in front of other people. We just go, you know, I always give people, I always, before a conversation, before training, I'll ask people for permission. I'm like, if any of you use any language or a word that I think that we could have a conversation about modifying, are you comfortable with it? And they'll, you know, I get everybody to agree first. And if they don't, I know who hasn't, and we'll take it offline. And it's just not using it as an opportunity to make yourself look above everyone, and just saying, when we were talking the other day, you know, you mentioned something and I found it really interesting. Are you open to a bit of feedback? Ask permission first. Most of the time, just like, I've been reading that actually, and I've learned that actually this is a better way, and these are the reasons why. Is that useful? You're not having a row, you're not making some, and you've asked them for it. If they don't want it, don't give them it, right? Does that
Yeah, that
help?
makes a lot of sense. It goes back to like the first topic we spoke about how we don't bash people over the head about it and all the rest of it. And it's like,
Don't work.
just don't weaponize it. And look, we're all humans, right? And this particular conversation has become a lot more popular. Like you said, the RecFest, right? It's one of the most talked about things. It wasn't like that when I got into recruitment. Most certainly wasn't like that when you got into recruitment yourself. But it is all about intent. And I think, you know, I see so much of this on social media that I've kind of just blocked it out now, because social media isn't
Charles,
real
I
life.
have as well. I
It's not,
blocked it because
yeah.
I can't be bothered being shouted at either.
Literally. But I on my Twitter, for example, my Twitter is predominantly for news on my interests, right? Sport, gaming,
Mm,
movies, etc. But then I start to see people posting videos of people arguing at university in Canada about being misgendered, and I'm like, I don't need to see that, because in real life it doesn't happen as much as what you see online. But it's
mm,
all about what you just said. It's all about intent. If I go to a training session and I say, morning guys, how's it all going, and someone puts their hand up and goes, do you know what, I found that a bit insensitive, I don't like you. Oh, appreciate that. My whole career I've said that. That's fine. If that's offended you, totally appreciate that. I'll completely change it. What do you find more comfortable? My barber, for example, is trans and had no idea that they were trans for the longest period of time. If I, for some reason, said something that was to be to offend him, he would pick me up on that, and I would say, okay, fair enough. But he knows that my intent is pure. I guess that could be a word. What I
hmm
think is wrong is if, for example, my barber, to be fair to him, looks like a typical bloke. He's got a beard, he's big and all the rest of it. You would never know that he's transitioned from a
mm,
biological woman. If he still looked very feminine, and I turned around and was like, "You're right, darling. You're right, girl," like that, purposely just to piss that person
yeah,
off, that's a totally different situation. So
it's a completely different
exactly. So going
situation.
back to what you said, let's not weaponize this conversation. There's all stuff that we can all learn about it. I love what you said about incorporating this into commercial conversations and business development conversations. We all need to have more empathy as a society, to be honest with you, for everything, for just life and for recruitment. But yeah, I don't know what else to say.
Well, we've had a really good, really, really good conversation. You've asked some, brilliant questions that had given me an opportunity to talk about stuff that I don't always talk about, because people are sometimes they don't know how to approach it. So I think you've been
Mm.
really brave in your questioning, and hopefully we've added some value to the listeners.
I mean, to be fair, if no one takes value from this, I have. I've taken value, so I've won. And to be
You've
fair,
won, winning.
I'm sure people will. But to be fair, from a selfish perspective, I'm going to be using a lot of what you said in my training. So happy days.
Amazing.
Well, as I always do to wrap up the show, Joe, I ask the guests, what can listeners do following this episode to be 1% better off in recruitment?
Get talking to clients without being an expert. Be inquisitive. In your next BD call, say, I've listened to this podcast. Can I have a chat with you about it? Is it something that you're doing? Is there somebody else in your business that's on all over this? Can I have a meeting with them? Like, this is for me. I hated business development and sales, as we discussed. I would use any old excuse to not have to pretend that I am a factory worker's wife to arrange a meeting. So if I have all of that, and that's why I've probably done quite well and been quite innovative in my recruitment career, because I was looking for products and services galore, any excuse to talk about anything that wasn't, have you got any jobs? So get inquisitive, be bold, be brave, get on the phone. You can't say anything wrong when you're just asking questions and asking someone's opinion.
Love it. I thought that is tremendous advice. It's very similar to what Leisha said about. I posted a clip earlier this morning about, to be successful in recruitment, you do have to be so inquisitive.
Yeah.
And I said on that
Yeah.
post, I don't care if you're introverted, extroverted, I don't care what background you have. To be successful in the recruitment industry, one of the key skills to have is curiosity and being inquisitive. And listen, like your experience that you just explained there will resonate to so many recruiters that really struggle with business development these days, right? Afraid of calling that VP or that director or whatever.
Mm,
Sometimes having that follow-up call with a client when they're not hiring, or they said call me
mm,
in 4 weeks, we've got an agency on it, and you're like, what do I mention in the conversation? Get their job description, put it in ChatGPT and ask, like, how good is this job description for attracting women, for example, or minority groups. Comes up on ChatGPT and says, more men would apply for this. And I've done a bit of training actually about that years ago, about certain that men will
mm,
apply for jobs if
yeah.
they're like 10% relevant.
Yeah, yeah.
So you have to change the language in the advert. And there you go. There's your follow-up to the client.
There's your follow up. Free stuff. ChatGPT 4 is your friend. Brilliant.
Love it. Well, Joe, thank you so much for coming on. I've really, really enjoyed this chat. And to be honest with you, I'm sure we could probably just chat until the cows come home. So
Thank you, Charles.
how can people get in touch with you? And what, just
Follow me
tell
on
people about?
LinkedIn. I post loads of content, so yeah, please do. Just search for me, Joe Major. I'll come up.
Nice one. All right, Joe, thank you so much. And yeah,
Cheers.
hopefully everyone took some value.
Thanks, Charles. Speak to you soon.